It's now my opportunity to present our theme that we're going to be using for the rest of the day. And that is the theme of this symposium, environmental justice issues in sustainable development. But this idea actually was conceived more than a year ago at a law professor conference in San Francisco. And I haven't mentioned this to Professor Gerard yet, but he and I were actually on a panel together it was January of 2011. And after the panel, we decided to go out to dinner. So we joined a couple of other professors, and we went to this very exotic restaurant. In fact, I believe it was French Vietnamese, and they ordered vegetarian. So it was this very bizarre, exotic meal. We were sitting there eating this very good meal in downtown San Francisco, and started to talk about the Cape Wind Project, which is a wind energy project off of Cape Cod, Massachusetts. And it's going to be the first offshore wind project in the United States. We're talking about the tremendous opposition to this project. And a lot of this opposition is rooted in the fact that wealthy property owners own land along that area, Cape Cod area, and they did not want to see wind turbines off in the distance in the bay. And so as we were talking, I had this grand idea. I said, well, why don't those areas, the wealthy areas, why don't their local governments, why don't we have a system under which they can pay a fee? So they pay a significant fee through increased property taxes or some other mechanism, all the people along there, and then this generates a lot of revenue, and then we'll take that revenue and we'll give it to people in, say, New Jersey, not to stigmatize New Jersey, some industrial area along the Atlantic coast. We'll just give all of that money to them because they can really use the money, and they'd be happy to have the wind farm be there, and I thought this was this great idea. And then Professor Gerard turned to me and he said, well, that would violate environmental justice. And that was my first time to really think about this issue, which is the tension that exists in some cases between sustainable development that is meant to combat climate change, like wind energy development, and environmental justice. Because a wind turbine in itself is really meant to indirectly prevent the same sort of environmental catastrophes that environmental justice is concerned about. It's meant to prevent the droughts that Colleen just talked about. It's really meant to prevent the sea level rise that I'm sure we'll hear about today. And yet, that project in itself might offend sort of environmental justice concerns in another way. The people who actually live closely to it might not want it there, and it could violate environmental justice in that sense. For those who maybe don't know what environmental justice is, it's a principle that environmental hazards and also environmental benefits should be equally distributed among all humankind, regardless of their ethnicity or their income. So this concept that I had, this idea of protecting the rich people from the wind turbines and putting them somewhere else and giving less fortunate people the chance to have them buy next to them and pay money, that would violate environmental justice. So that is the tension that we're going to use to focus today in our symposium. And now I'm going to introduce our panel. We're privileged to have a panel of 3 experts in environmental justice and for sustainability law here with us today. I'm going to introduce all 3 of them to you now. And they will each have about 25 to 30 minutes to speak. And at the end of all 3 panelists' presentations, we'll then open up the floor for questions. And we'll have questions that will stop at about 11:30. So let's go ahead and introduce our first panelist. I'm going to introduce all 3 now, and then we'll turn over the time over to our first. Our first panelist is going to be Professor John Dernbach. He is the Distinguished Professor of Law at the Widener Law School. He's also the Director of the Environmental Law Center there. Professor Dernbach graduated cum laude from the University of Michigan School of Law. He has published very extensively on sustainable development. He's written several very influential books. He's also, particularly his book, Agenda for a Sustainable America, has been a very, very influential book in sustainability law. He's also the author of an influential book on legal writing and is working on another book right now. And our second panelist is Professor Patrick McGinley. Professor McGinley is the Charles H. Hayden Professor of Law at West Virginia University, the School of Law. He has been there for 36 years in West Virginia. He's a graduate of the Duke University School of Law and has published dozens of articles, particularly in his area. He is focused on coal mining and the environmental justice issues associated with that. He was awarded in 2000 the Public Justice Foundation's prestigious Public Justice Achievement Award, and so we're looking forward to hearing from him. And then our third panelist is Professor Uma Alcott. She is an associate professor of law at Kansas University School of Law. She graduated summa cum laude from the University of Maine School of Law, first year class, and she recently served as a visiting scholar in energy and land use law at Florida State for 2 years. Her research, I really enjoyed reading her research since I entered the academy, particularly in the area of renewable energy siting and land use. And her articles have been published in journals such as the Stanford Environmental Law Journal, College of Law Quarterly. And she's also someone who gets invited to lots of symposiums. In fact, I found out that this spring alone she's going to be at Case Western and Vanderbilt and here, which is a lot of symposium invites in one semester. So I'll go ahead and turn our time. Please give me a round of applause for all of our panelists.
Good morning, everybody. Just curious about who all is here. How many of you are undergraduates? Okay. How many of you are graduate students here, not for law school? Okay, good. How many of you are law students? Okay, and members of the bar? Okay, we've got a good mix then this morning. I want to start by congratulating the law school on what it's inaugurating here today, and Troy and Professor Rule and everybody who worked on getting this together. I also want to congratulate the folks who were honored this morning with the awards, in particular Colleen. What impressed me was not only what you had to say, and the thoughtfulness of what you had to say about the project, but the thing you didn't say, which is how adventurous you must be, because I'm gathering a lot of those pictures belong to you. Good for you. Good for you. All right. What I'm going to try and do today is on the panel, we talked about who should go in what order. And we decided I would go first because I'm going to give you the 30,000-foot view. What you're going to hear from Professor McGinley is something about coal mining, and then Professor Alka is going to be talking about renewable energy. And in each case, specific issues that illustrate some of the broader points that I hope to make. I'm particularly honored to be on the panel with Professor McGinley. He and I have known each other longer than I want to tell you. You tell somebody, oh, I've known him since 1981, okay, that sort of sets you apart from other relationships that you might have. And Professor Alka is a little newer on the scene, but after dinner last night and various other conversations that I've had with her, I'm honored to be on the panel with her as well. She's doing very, very good work as a more junior academic person. And so this is all good. All right, I'm going to try and do three things. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about sustainability, and the perspective that I'm going to give you is not a vision that I had on the mountain, but rather sort of try and articulate as carefully as I can what the international community understands sustainability to be based on the agreements that were reached at the Earth Summit in 1992 with the support and cooperation of the first Bush administration. Then I want to talk to you a little bit about environmental justice, and what I'm particularly interested in doing is connecting environmental justice back to sustainability, and then finally talk a little bit about what this all means for the United States. What I'm going to be doing here is giving you a little bit of a sneak preview of some things that are in the book that Professor Rule alluded to. Oops, wrong one. There we go. All right. In terms of understanding sustainability, just as a basic thing, this is the definition that is most widely quoted. Everybody feels obliged to quote this definition at some point or another. The definition comes from a report by the World Commission on Environmental Development, also known as the Brundtland Commission. The report was issued in 1987. And I met someone who worked on this report 2 years ago in China, and he's explained to me that as a young lawyer, Brohart from Brooklyn, who's heading this commission, asked him and some other folks to go off and said, well, look, we've got this long book about sustainability. What we need is a one-sentence definition, and I'll give you an hour to write it. And that's what they came up with. One thing to build on what Colleen said is notice that you won't see the word environment here. This is about development. And that has actually environmental justice implications that I'll be talking about. What everybody seemed to recognize, and certainly things haven't changed all that much in 1987, is that there were two big problems. One was there were environmental problems all over the world. You've heard about those. And the other thing is you have widespread poverty. There are something like, right now, 2.7 billion people, as the B, live on less than $2 a day around the world. And the kind of poverty that they experience is actually quite different from the kind of poverty you see in most places in the United States. Why do we see that? The underlying root causes that you hear about again and again when we talk about sustainability, although we don't often talk about them in the context of specific issues, are consumption and population growth. Now, what happened, the World Commission on Environmental Development, the Berlin Commission's report, led to the Earth Summit, known by the more formal name that's described on the slide. And what's important about the Earth Summit, what's really important about the Earth Summit, is that countries of the world decided then that to endorse sustainable development. It had been an idea first, I think, the International Union of Conservation Networks had developed it, and then the World Commission report. This was the first time that countries all over the world had really said, yes, sustainable development is something that we ought to do. There were a couple of documents, Agenda 21, the Rio Declaration, and so forth, that they agreed to. These are all non-binding documents. And the United States was very actively involved in this under the first Bush administration. And so as a starting point, this is, if you will, the point of departure that a lot of us use in talking about sustainable development, the Earth Summit. Now, whoops, I keep pushing this the wrong way. Now, a lot of folks wonder about what sustainable development still means. And what I want to try and articulate for you is how this is in order to understand what development means, or sustainable development, it's first important to have some understanding of what development is about, in particular what's important, how it's understood at the international level. A lot of us think of development as what happened to the favorite place where we used to play as kids that got converted into housing or a strip mall or a highway or something like that. And you hear development used a lot in that particular way. That is a form of economic development. But at the international level, development means something quite different. And what happens at the international level really can be traced back to, I trace it back at least to the post-war planning that Churchill and Roosevelt and others were doing before World War II ended. And the basic idea was this, the basic question was this: we're in the middle of a war now that we are likely to win. We have the Great Depression that preceded that contributed to the starting of that war. How do we prevent that war, another world war, and another Great Depression from happening again? What kind of structure, international, do we need to put in place to make that happen? And at the end of World War II, there were treaties. The organizing principle was an idea called development. And development really had three big parts: peace and security, economic development, and social development for human rights. Every single one of those is supported by one or more international treaties. Peace and security is the United Nations, of course. You all heard about the Security Council. Economic development, you have you have trade agreements, you have the World Bank, you have the agreement that set up the International Monetary Fund. And social development or human rights came out of the War Crimes Tribunals. It was turned into a UN General Assembly resolution in the late 1940s on human rights, and then finally became articulated in multinational treaties that have more than 100 parties by the 1960s. All three of those together are what development is about. And in the post-war thinking that folks were doing, the environment really wasn't on the screen. The population of the world then was, I think, 2 or 3 billion people, much less than it was now. The environmental issues just didn't seem as pressing. Now, what's interesting about this model of development is how enormously successful it has been on its own terms. People are living longer. We did not have a third world war. The economy is growing. People are better educated all over the world. And if you say, and if you say, well, what do we mean by progress? A lot of us would say, well, that sounds like progress. And so what happens is if you think about development, it's easy to begin by saying, well, development is something that should only be concerned to specialists and so forth, but actually not. Development comes pretty close to capturing what we mean by progress in our world. Living conditions for a lot of people are better now than they have ever been. The problem is, and this is the model that we all live with, all right, is the price of progress has been the environment. Now, here's the problem. This is the thing that has gotten underneath all the conversations about sustainable development, all of them, okay, is understanding this. The world population continues to grow, the world economy continues to grow, and environmental degradation continues to grow. And all of those things taken together undermine development. They make wars more likely. They make it harder for people to. They impede public health. They damage the economy in lots and lots of ways. There's a World Bank report explaining that, like by 6, 7, 8 percentage points, the extent to which GDP, the Chinese economy, is undermined by all the various health problems, particularly air and water pollution, are causing in that country. And when you come back, this is the key premise. Everything else that I'm going to be talking about today follows from this. And so the sustainable development model redefines progress. Instead of development at the environment's expense, what we talk about instead is development in the environment, environmental protection and restoration going together with conventional development, making conventional development and environmental protection and restoration happening at the same time. And when you really get to the bottom of it, and you understand it that way, you can see why I've said, all right, I think sustainable development may be one of the most important ideas to come out of the 20th century. And because what it does is it changes the model of how we see the environment. It changes, I think, or could change the model of how we see the environment. Another way to understand sustainable development is functionally. If you say, well, look, what sustainability is the whole reason we had this conference is because we have growing poverty and growing environmental degradation, and it follows as night and day that sustainable development is development that addresses those exact problems and solves them or resolves them. Now, one thing to keep in mind about this, all right, is that the initial impetus for development, when FDR and Churchill and the post-war planners were sort of thinking about this, they said, well, look, if you give people freedom and opportunity and quality of life, we're less likely to have a Great Depression again. We're less likely to have another world war. If you provide people with those kinds of things, that's where you want to go. And that's really the objective of development. Now, what happens, sustainable development basically doesn't change that. A lot of people want to say sustainable development is about some kind of environment first, looking at all the caves, and those people have no idea what they're talking about. What sustainable development is about, all right, is it preserves basically the same kind of human-centered view of things, except that it's human-centered in the context of we're going to do those things in an environment that is being protected and restored at the same time. Imagine a world in which the ordinary effects of human activity protect and restore the environment, whether people are thinking about and caring about the environment or not, or at least whether most people do. And then add to that a notion that we're not just talking about the current generation, we're talking about future generations as well. And you begin to get some of the tweaks that sustainable development provides, but fundamentally the human endpoint here does not change. So what happens when we talk about sustainable development is we're talking about protecting the environment, we're talking about doing environment and development at the same time. And this is actually a fairly different way of thinking about the environment than you may have seen before. And so when you folks talk about sustainable development, and you want a journal that focuses on sustainable development, what you're talking about is a journal that is not just another name for environmental protection. It's a way of thinking about how do we make conventional development, including, and particularly perhaps economic development, work together with the environment instead of against it. Instead of fighting things all the time, how do we constructively move forward in ways that reconcile our common goals? Now, how does all that, so that's sustainable development. and to summarize, it's a way of making the economic development, social development, and security work together with environmental protection and restoration. And not simply at the international level, but at specific places, like the United States, like the state of Missouri, like the city of Columbia, like the University of Missouri. Specific places, in specific ways, moving the ball forward in that particular way. Well, now what about environmental justice? Well, as a starting point, the Rio Declaration that was endorsed at the Earth Summit in 1992 was a set of principles for sustainable development. One of the principles, and frankly, the Rio Declaration has had more staying power, if you will, than Agenda 21, which was this comprehensive sort of plan for sustainable development that in many ways is still a very good checklist, but in many ways is a little dated. But the Rio Declaration has some staying power. And one of the important things about this, I know there's some economists in the room, all right, is there's a view of pollution. That what happens with pollution is if I have a factory, okay, or whatever it happens to be, I benefit from that. But if the factory creates pollution, that the costs of that get imposed on other people. And the idea here, when we talk about internalization of costs from an environmental economics point of view, is that instead of me getting the benefits and imposing the costs on others, okay, I should incur the cost myself of controlling the pollution so that the costs of pollution don't get imposed on other people. And when we talk about internalizing costs, when we talk about the polluter pays principle here, that's what we're talking about. And so this is foundational to sustainable development. Now, let me give you an example of this. National Academy of Sciences published a report in 2010, and you can see the conclusions they've reached, and I'm not going to read them to you. But the thing that I want you to think about and understand when you see this slide, all right, is this is after 40 years of air pollution controlling those exact same facilities. 40 years of air pollution control directed at exactly those same facilities. And after all of that, we still get these kinds of costs from coal burning. All right, and think about how this works, okay? The people that experience this, all right, may not even know they're dying prematurely because of this. They are white and black. They are rich and poor. All right, and most of these deaths occur in the eastern part of the United States. So here's the bottom line. When you think about the environment, all right, and when you think about sort of what pollution is really all about, it is easy, and many people still do, to sort of blow off environmental protection as, you know, well, if you want to go off and hug trees and all the rest of that, you go right ahead, but I've got more important things to do. And it ignores, that perspective ignores the underlying factual reality, all right, that pretty much everything that pollutes the environment sooner or later hurts other people. That's it. That's really how it works. If you want to improve people's lives, you improve the quality of the environment. If you want to hurt people's lives, hurt the environment. And here's a bunch of different sort of examples of that. You can see there. You can see them, there's sort of a variety of different sorts of examples. But the point is pretty much the same. And a lot of people don't talk about it that way, but that's actually how it works. And that has a very large consequence. And that consequence is this, all right? Pretty much all environmental pollution and degradation is environmental injustice. Pretty much all of it. And you can say, well, look, if I'm running my factory and I'm creating this pollution and it's hurting other people, well, a lot of those people are employed in my factory, and that's a good thing, and I don't deny that. All right? But another way of thinking about this is that pretty much what environmental pollution does is it redistributes wealth, and it redistributes well-being. That's what it does. Okay? And maybe in a less polluted world, in a less populated world, that wasn't true. But basically, that's how it works now. And it is absolutely true that some people experience this more immediately than others. Minorities, poor people, I get that. But the broader point is, and this is a serious point, is that everybody is put in a different place in some respect because of environmental pollution and degradation. That has two consequences for sustainable development. And that's why one of the things I was trying to do is explain the relationship between this and sustainable development. One is unsustainable development fosters environmental injustice. Okay? That's how it works. Some people benefit, some people get hurt. They're usually not the same people, and they're usually not the same degree. Okay? It follows as well that sustainable development should foster environmental justice. Okay? Just flip it around and it works the other way. You protect and restore the environment at the same time that you build the economy and create jobs and work for security. That also creates environmental justice and certainly helps to make the economy. So, what does all of that mean for the United States? Okay, where does this conversation take us? And what I'm going to try and do here is give it to you from 30,000 feet, and it's based on a project that I've been doing with the Environmental Law Institute now since 1997. The Environmental Law Institute is an organization in Washington, D.C., a nonprofit organization that is a think tank and a publisher, and I'm really honored to be participating with the Environmental Law Institute. It's also an organization that manages to speak to people and work with people on all sides of these issues, and I like that as well. And I came back I was working with the state of Pennsylvania in 1992, went down for a week to the Earth Summit and in Rio, and got very, very interested in that. And I was teaching in early 1997, in the spring of 1997, a seminar that moved over to Wyvern at that point. I'm teaching a seminar on sustainability in the law. And I asked each of my guys, I said, well, look, here it is, it's the spring of 1997. In June of 1997, the UN General Assembly is going to be meeting in New York, and they're going to be doing a 5-year review of progress that has occurred since the Earth Summit. So I told my students, we're going to take a look at how the United States has done. And if you want to be part of this project, this is what you do. If you don't want to be part of this project, that's okay, but not in the seminar. And I gave them a list of topics, and everybody wrote about something: hazardous waste, forestry, foreign aid, lots of different topics. And I told them, I'm going to take all your papers, I'm going to put them together in an article that I'm going to publish in my name and the seminar's name, so every single one of you will get credit for this. And so in May of 1997, when the seminar was over, I took all their papers, and at this point, I actually found a way to post it online. I'm still proud of that. Okay, early adopter, right? I got this stuff online in 1997, and I went up to New York to find, okay, that this professor at a law school in South Central Pennsylvania and his 17 students had done the only comprehensive report that anyone had done on the United States, how the United States had done in the first 5 years following the Earth Summit. And I was really kind of surprised by that. I figured, well, somebody who's better funded and all that would have some kind of a report, because after all, when the Earth Summit happened, my God, it was a big event. A lot of you remember this. It was on the front cover of all the magazines. It was daily coverage in the newspapers. This was the summit that was going to save the Earth. And there were skeptics who said, well, no, people go home, nothing is going to happen. And I said, well, no, that isn't true. And then this happened to me. Okay? So, and then I thought, well, all right. And what we found out is really not much had happened in the first 5 years. So in 2002, I got together a bunch of experts, people from Stanford and Yale, the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, people who are working on specific topics in specific places, not sort of the rah-rah kind of thing, but making it happen, sustainability practitioners. And I said, well, let's do a more comprehensive assessment. And we did more comprehensive assessments, pretty much the same group in 2002 and 2009. Both of those are published as books. And then this year, okay, we're in another couple of months, and I keep working on this. Okay, so a new book is being published, Acting as If Tomorrow Matters. If you sense a little bit of attitude in the title, well, yeah, I would confess to that, and I would confess to it because it's beginning to be clear to me that there's a very large disconnect between what we say and what we do. between what we say about future generations and the importance of future generations and actually how we behave with respect to caring about future generations, including Colleen and all her colleagues in this room who are much younger than I am. Okay? There's a big disconnect. And so, so this particular book is asking a little different question, not so much about what to do, but how to do it. And I want to share with you a little bit about what we found that is relevant to environmental justice, and give you a little bit of a preview for this. And in order to give you a preview for this, what I need to do is give you a little bit of context about what's going on right now in the U.S. economy. I'm just going to show you a couple of things. All right. This is a teeny bit dated. All right. But basically, this is what you've got going on right now. If you go back to 1970, you will find that unemployment is about as high as it's been. Maybe it's coming down a little bit from that. Poverty rate is still pretty high. We're not where we were 10 years ago, to be very sure. The other thing you'll see, all right, is that household income across the United States is deeply, deeply stratified. The richest 20%, okay, come home with a little more than half the income, and that's basically the world in which we live right now. And there's a lot of work that's been done to basically see that isn't changing very much, except that it might be getting worse. And that's actually what this third slide shows. These are all John Foreman at the University of Oklahoma Law School, and a law school classmate of mine, and Roberta Mann at the University of Oregon Law School, who was part of the project together, but you can see what's going on. That's the background in which we talk about this. Now remember, what I was saying when I talked about environment is I said, well look, environmental degradation takes people and it puts them in a worse place than they would have been. There's an important way in which environmental degradation pushes the income groups apart and creates more inequality. And that's really the question that we were trying to ask is, well, okay, so if we look at U.S. environmental policy over the last 20 years, what is U.S. environmental policy really, what kind of an impact has it had on this inequity? Well, as a starting point, I think we need to give some credit to environmental law for reducing the inequity that exists. Because basically what environmental law does is it sets national standards for air pollution, water pollution, hazardous waste, and drinking water. And those standards are applied or are intended to be applied across all racial groups, across all economic groups, and all the rest. I'm not saying it works that way. I'm not making an argument that environmental law has made everything perfect. But what I'm saying is that I think environmental law deserves some credit. The air is cleaner now than it used to be. The water is cleaner now than it used to be. We don't have big valleys and drums like one of the pictures that I showed you before. All right, that's the starting point. The second thing that you'll see is that we've had a for real environmental justice movement. It started probably back in the 1980s. This is one place dated from. And what happened is there are a number of instances around the United States when it became really, it seemed to a lot of folks that the hazardous waste facilities, improper disposal of chemicals was occurring in places predominantly, disproportionately, in places that were low income and minority. President Clinton issued an executive order in 1994 that was intended to sort of make that better. EPA issues grants on that. There's an active environmental justice program. And that issue, at least, is on everybody's radar screen. And other people, I think, who speak later today can speak in more detail to what's happening. Mike Gerard has produced books on the topic. But I just want to share with you one of the developments, again, that's occurred in the last, say, 20 or so years, is there's more attention being paid to environmental justice. The third thing that has happened in the last 20 years, all right, is that more attention, particularly in the last few years, is more attention is being paid to green jobs. So what's really interesting about green jobs is it looks like there's an environmental justice aspect in doing this. Because what happens is low and middle skilled workers, they get more opportunities. Some of the median wages in a lot of these jobs tend to be a little better than the overall average. And the larger question that green jobs raise, because you can't have green jobs without green employers. And you can't have green employers unless they're green corporations or other organizations. And what happens here is you're seeing more and more interest in using economic development as a tool to create jobs, okay, as a tool to reduce pollution.
And all across the country now, what states are experimenting with, and they've been doing this now for 20 years, is improving energy efficiency, making renewable energy happen to a much greater degree than it has been. And there's a lot of state and local tools, legal tools, renewable portfolio standards, net metering, and other legal tools that are being employed to do that. And one of the really interesting things about this, all right, is basically if you invest $1 on behalf of sustainability, you're more likely to get benefits than if you say, I'm going to invest $1 in economic development alone and the rest of it I don't care about. Okay? You're more likely to create jobs, improve the environment, all right, build the economy, and even improve security if you do that. And the other thing is all across the country, in all kinds of really interesting ways, unsustainable development, okay, hurts low-income people the most. And let me give you an example among many that I can give. If you need to drive a long way to get to your job or to get your kids to school, the challenge of getting a mortgage is going to be a lot bigger because when they do the financials for you, the thing they're going to be looking at in terms of, when you get a mortgage, they survey your financial well-being. They say, well, you've got a car, you're low income, we're not sure you can afford a house. And a lot of people have to choose in some ways between home ownership and car ownership. And a lot of the people over the last few years who have experienced mortgage foreclosures the most are the people who live farthest from their jobs. All right? So not having walkable, livable communities where people are where there's more compact development, where people can take a bus to work, all right, makes it it increases sort of the basic cost of living for people. It makes it a lot harder for them. People with means, having a car, having a house, no big deal. But if you don't have means, all right, it's a harder thing in unsustainable development. And that is one of the many ways in which that hurts poor people. All right. A fourth issue that is becoming more and more important is the issue of climate justice. It is a global version of environmental justice. Basically, the gist of this is that what happens with climate change, the impacts of climate change are going to land most heavily on people in developing countries. And folks I know who have gone to the International Climate Conference year after year after year point out that to me, and I've seen this myself, this is a photo I took a couple of years ago in Bali, is that developing countries are not sitting back and saying, oh, it's okay that greenhouse gas emissions are hurting us everywhere. It's all right with us. We understand that you have to do development and somehow we'll live with it. Not a chance. And they're being much, much, much more aggressive and frankly a lot more angry. And the conversation about climate change now is not simply limited to what developed countries feel like they want to do, but it's also more focused on the injustice that developing countries are experiencing and saying that they're experiencing. The one last thing I'll just say briefly is lead poisoning is an issue where it is deeply an environmental justice issue, but it's an issue over the last number of decades where we've claimed a lot of progress. Lead paint has been phased out, gas has been phased out. There's warnings now on paint under federal law. I have how many minutes? Am I over? All right. So here's what I want to share with you in terms of we'll end this. Okay, is what do you get? How do you sort of move environmental justice along by accelerating the transition to sustainability? All right. One of the things is I think if people have more choices and there are more options available, they're going to exercise them. One of the interesting things that we've seen over the last 20 years is that there are choices. There are actually more choices now than there used to be. If you want a LEED certified building, you want a green building, there's a certification program for that. If you want sustainable paper for your book, the Forest Curators Council actually has a sustainable forest certification program. There's a lot of that. The second, so just putting more sustainable choices in front of people is one thing that can be done. Moving law more in the direction of sustainability, not just using environmental regulation, is important for that. When I talk about visionary and pragmatic governance, what I'm talking about is governance that both sort of sees what we ought to be doing, from a sustainability point of view, has a vision of where we need to be going, but it's also deeply factually based, learns from experience, and understands that in order to make this happen, there's going to be some trial and error quality. And finally, and this is, well, if we're really going to accelerate the transition, if we're really going to make environmental justice happen, I think we need a national sustainability movement. And what that really comes down to is this. What sustainability is really all about is people figuring out what this means for them where they are. Okay? And the progress that we've made over the last 20 years has been people doing that in corporations, all right, in universities. The sustainability work in college and universities last 20 years is really impressive. It's figuring out what that means. There is too much to do. There is too little time. We are there are too many different kinds of things to do. To rely on other people or smaller groups to do this. We all need to figure out in our own way, wherever we are, including the University of Missouri, here in Columbia, okay, in this state, we all need to figure out in our own specific place, in our lives, as we go back from wherever we are now, what this all means for us. And that, I think, is where I'll leave it. Thank you very much. Oh, Pat, you want me to take that down?
Good morning. It's my pleasure being here at the launching of this new law review, new focus. Thrilled to be here on this panel and with the keynote speakers, all of whom I know the highest regard for. I guess actually John Bernbach, as he's indicated, I've known him the longest. We worked in the same office I did, or at least not the same location after me, and then we litigated against each other. I sued the state of Pennsylvania, my employer, with regard to issues regarding the reclamation of underground and surface coal mines. So, environmental justice, a view from the coal fields. John said when he started out he wasn't going to speak from the mountain. Well, and he spoke from 30,000 feet. He gave us a sort of a world overview of sustainability, what are the goals, what are the failures, where we go from here. Well, I don't speak from 30,000 feet. I don't speak from the mountain. I speak from my experience in the hollows of central Appalachia, below what used to be mountain tops, that have been blown apart to reach coal that supplies this nation's insatiable thirst for electricity. I'm speaking to you from the front end of the fuel cycle that ultimately impacts global climate. There, more recently, in the last few years, there's been attention paid to what's going on in the coal fields of Appalachia. There's even civil disobedience. Sit-ins on mountaintop removal sites. Group that articulates the importance of the struggle relating to the externalities of coal mining as ground zero of climate change. West Virginia, Kentucky, Western Virginia. And if you look out at the Great Plains in Montana and Wyoming as well. The concept of environmental justice, John talked about that too, and our other speakers will as well. I have my own personal view and definition of environmental justice. And it really is as broad in some ways as the Rio principle that John spoke about, much narrower than others. Scholars have looked quite appropriately at the disproportionate impacts of development and creation of environmental hazards on racial, ethnic minorities. My definition, I think, is much like John's when he says environmental harm hurts everyone, but it doesn't hurt everyone equally. So when I talk about environmental justice and teaching my seminar on environmental justice, when I write about it, I think of environmental justice as the disempowerment of individuals, the disempowerment of families, disempowerment of communities, where they don't have a voice in what happens to them, to their environment, to their economy. So that's a pretty broad definition. It goes beyond ethnic and ethnicity and race. Sustainable and renewable energy obviously responds to the challenge of climate change. I see environmental justice in my own experience, and I litigate. I don't only teach. I felt as part of a public service obligation, a state land grant university, the phone rings, and there's an exceptional circumstance where there are disempowered communities and the law's being broken that my wife keeps telling me to say no, and someday I'll learn it. But it feels like environmental justice in an energy war zone. That's the feeling I have. Because of the conflict and the emotion and the politics and the money that is all involved in the mix of extracting that form of energy, coal, that contributes almost 50% of the electric power in this country. Addressing climate change, as Professor Dernbach said, has huge human rights and social justice dimensions. But environmental justice also means addressing collateral damage of the shift to renewable energy and sustainable development from carbon fuels. A significant portion of the greenhouse gases fueling climate change are produced by coal combustion, principally from coal-fired power plants. But coal combustion-induced climate change isn't the only externality created by coal mining, by coal burning and waste disposal. John showed you a slide. It's a report of the National Academy of Sciences that put a dollar value on air pollution from coal-fired power plants. That's enormous, and it has public health impacts, but that's not all. Those that are concerned about climate change and its dangers and about environmental and social justice and human rights properly should be focusing also on coal's externalities. We've got a little slideshow, a couple of videos, if I can pull it off. I don't know, I'm not a techie, and I usually run into problems when I fool around with PowerPoint, but I'm going to give it a try. And I think the old adage that one picture is worth 1,000 words is true, if I can actually get this to work properly. And I've already forgotten which of the 3 buttons. Bottom. Okay, so we'll give this a try. I'll give you a little commentary here. If I can get a couple of short video clips I wanted to show you, and I'm going to wrap it up with some words from a coal miner and another guy that was a coal miner and now is a leader of American labor. So I don't know where I point this thing. So invest in renewable energy, and there's all that energy and activism and force behind the recognition that climate change is an enormous threat, and then we have the climate deniers. And there's pushback, and there are a lot of people in the middle that say, well, where does the truth lie? And that we continue fighting that battle. So here's a little bit of information. I really don't have to say anything, and the point here is for you to understand where coal comes in to the picture with regard to climate change and reining in the impacts of coal development. Professor Gerard and I were talking last night about China, and he'll get you depressed in his talk. I could do that. 2 new coal-fired power plants a week in China is pretty depressing, as we are fighting about whether we ought to decommission 40 and 50-year-old coal-fired power plants that contribute a tremendous amount of CO2 to the atmosphere. And here's the point. Coal is America's most abundant and cheapest source of energy. That's what the coal industry and the electric power industry says. I call them, actually I stole this from an author of a book about coal industry. I call them big coal. So the companies that mine coal and the companies that burn it and transport it, there are billions and billions and billions of dollars of investment. And they do produce the energy that turns our lights on, powers our laptops, and electricity is important. And coal has been and will continue to be important for a period in the future. What are the costs? Well, this is a huge equipment used in mountaintop removal. This is a person. The drag line, this big apparatus, the buckets, would put several Greyhound buses in it, and its length is 100 yards, the length of a football field. Blow off the tops of the mountains, scrape off the coal, push the rock into headwater streams, blow off more of the mountain, and do the same thing. In some areas of southern West Virginia, there are 18 coal seams that lie horizontally into the surface. Longwall mining. 2 modern types of highly productive coal mining that doesn't require the vast number of coal miners that conventional older types of mining require. In 1980, there were 80,000 coal miners. West Virginia, today there are 22,000. And West Virginia Coal Company is producing more coal. Longwall mining cuts off a block of coal, seam of coal, under the ground, sometimes 500, even 1,000 feet deep, in swaths, 1,000, 1,500 feet wide, and 2 miles long. Does that have any impact on the environment? Does that have any impact on the rural people that live above the coal mine? Many of them coal miners and coal miners' families? Of course it does. Rock strata breaks, houses' foundations are damaged, well and spring water is lost, streams literally disappear underground. How do I know? I've represented some of this. That's an externalized cost. How many of you know about that? How many of us think about that when we turn on the lights? When we power up our laptops? Just generalization. Coal miner deaths, injuries, underground accidents, surface mining accidents, black lung disease, Externalities. How about this one? 1969 to 2004. It's hard to quantify the cost of a stream that's polluted by coal mining. And you can do it. There are marine economists that can do that. How many trips did people that used to go there fishing not take, and how much did they not spend at the local store for provisions? But here's a figure. We can put a dollar value on $41 billion in black lung payments. $41 billion to families of coal miners who suffered from black lung over that period of time. That's quantifiable. It doesn't include the impact on the families and the communities of those people that ended up like this person. Shocking. In the last 10 years, 10,000 former coal miners have died of black lung. Black lung is supposed to be over. Department of Labor, the Mine Safety and Health Administration, their view was less than 2% of coal miners in modern coal mining suffer from black lung. Not so. How do I know? Well, my wife Suzanne has been back there, and I took part in the governor's independent investigation of the Upper Big Branch mining disaster. It killed 29 miners. And we spent a year and a half listening to miners talk. The thing that really struck me, and it came very early on, was when we confidentially received the autopsy reports on those miners whose bodies weren't so harmed that they could take a look at their lungs. Over 70% of those miners had black lung in this day and age. Some as young as 25 years old. Where's the law? Where's the justice? That's a co-externality. 100,000 fatal injuries in a coal mine. We're doing a lot better. Enormously better. Still have a lot of injuries. That's externality. When we started out with mining coal in this country, it was like China is today, killing 10,000 coal miners a year. How many are maimed? How many suffer from black lung? And that's the worldwide externalities of coal. Underground mine subsidence. This is a good one, not far from where I live in Morgantown, just over the Mason-Dixon line. Nice lake, right? Not so much. After Consol Energy undermined it, dry lake. Lawsuit, Consol Energy, no, we didn't do it. Lake's been there for 30 years. They used modern longwall mining nearby. Water was gone. Couldn't do it. That's in litigation. Now, there, acid mine drainage. What's that? Manganese, iron precipitates out from drainage from coal mines in some regions of Appalachia. Cost is enormous. Biologically dead. Acid means pH less than 5, and plus you have the minerals that drop out in stainless streams. Dunkard Creek. Who would have thought, and this is a bad picture, they had muskies in Dunkard Creek up until about 2 years ago, this big. No, maybe not that. That is a fisherman's story. That's a story my grandson Liam would tell about the fish that he caught. They're all dead. Dunkard Creek, little known wonder, hidden off in southwestern Pennsylvania, not much wider than from here over to the end of the screen. Bass, muskies, perch, dead. 40 miles drainage from coal mine. Externalities. What's the cost of that? It's a little Dunkard Creek. Mountaintop removal. 1,500 miles of headwater streams buried. Of course, understand that's mining in progress. There is reclamation. It doesn't look like that. government agencies give awards for the sort of the rocky, weed-strewn remnants of former mountain ridges where nothing will grow. There's no incentive for economic development. But that gives you a sense of the scale of mining. Headwater stream, that was a valley. Can you picture it? Fill up all this material here. Used to be the tops of West Virginia mountains. Sometimes they're not constructed according to engineering design. Mercury. Byproduct of burning coal. I'm trying to think of what volume. I think it's the volumes what our grandkids talk about. Zillions of tons of coal waste. A couple of years ago, I don't know, maybe you read about this. Coal combustion waste in town that collapsed in Tennessee. I'd like to live in that house. I mean, this is not the Maine coast. It might appear that there's a tributary to the Tennessee River. Still goes unregulated by the federal government. Is it really toxic? The industry says, no, it's not much different than soil in your backyard. I'm not a scientist. But others think differently. Some scientists say that's not right. Whoops. Whoops, I don't know which one I'm doing. This, it's okay. It's a nice thing. Sierra Club. I've represented Sierra Club. They've got, some of you may know, Beyond Coal campaign. How am I doing with time? 10 minutes? I don't know if I can do this properly. A little video clip. See if I can. Oops. Shoot.
I want to say this. I'm in this industry. I'm building these plants right now. I'm on a board of a company called BrightSource, which is building the biggest solar thermal plant in the world, 2.7 gigawatts, the biggest power plant in America. We're building it in California, and we're building it at the same cost per gigawatt you could build a coal plant, about $3 billion a gigawatt. But once we build that plant, it's free energy forever. Once you build the coal plant, now you got to go cut down the Appalachian Mountains and ship them across the country in coal cars, warp every train track in this country so we can't have high-speed rail, build the roads, the coal haul roads so thick in West Virginia at taxpayer expense that it's costing the state $200 million a year to build and maintain them, another subsidy to coal. Then you got to burn the stuff, poison every river and lake in America, kill 60,000 Americans with ozone and particulates, cause 1 million asthma attacks a year, sterilize all the lakes in the Adirondacks. These are the true costs of coal. Once you build a solar plant, it's free energy forever. The photons are hitting our country every day for free. All we've got to do is pick them up. We build at the same price we can build coal. You can build wind plants even cheaper than you can build a coal plant. And guess what? The Midwest of our country is the Saudi Arabia of wind. We have more wind in North Dakota is the windiest place on the planet. We have enough wind in North Dakota, Montana, and Texas to provide 100% of the energy needs in this country for the next 50 years. We have enough solar in an area, and this is from the Scientific American peer-reviewed study, 75 miles by 75 miles in the desert Southwest to provide 100% of the energy needs of our country, even if every American owned an electric car. We use about 1,000 gigawatts a year, or day, during peak demand. 500 of those are carbon. To eliminate those and replace them with solar and wind will cost us $1.3 trillion. That's about half the price of the Iraq war. We have free energy forever. We never have to give all that money to Iraq. And we don't have to poison the people and impoverish the people of Appalachia in order to do it. This is a real solution for our country, and it's one we ought to be embracing. And we need to embrace, as Senator Byrd said, right here in West Virginia, instead of trying to build an economy, a 19th century economy, a 19th century future, by looking into a rear view mirror.
Okay. Makes a good case for moving away from coal. You forgot something. That was a debate between him and the notorious, some of you may have heard this name, Don Blankenship, former chairman and CEO of Massey Energy Company. It was a debate, not written. The auditorium at the University of Charleston in the state's capital was packed. It was a gymnasium filled with people. More than half the people were from coal mining families, worked in the coal industry. What did he leave out? He left them out. Environmental justice, sustainability, can't be leaving out those who, especially those who have been harmed by those externalities that you saw just flash by on the screen. Environmental justice means no coal miner, no coal mining family, no coal mining community is left behind as we move forward toward a more sustainable future to alternative energy. Let's just go to this little clip too. It's, when I have this.
The Senate Environment and Public Works Committee released a report that outlines the economic impact of the EPA's holding up a perfectly valid. This report brings to light yet another example of the EPA's war on coal that threatens our energy and economic security. The report found that 190 coal mining operations are being held up. These mines are expected to produce over 2 billion tons of coal, and 81 small businesses rely on these permits to keep their doors open. The EPA is jeopardizing 1 out of every 4 coal mining jobs and over 162,000 indirect jobs in Appalachia. Enough is enough. With nearly double-digit unemployment throughout the Appalachian region, the Obama administration should tell its EPA to stop its political attacks on coal. Now is the time to put politics aside so thousands of citizens in Appalachia can return to work.
War on coal. Those of you interested in sustainable development, environmental justice, you're participating in a war on coal. And more than that, a war on coal miners and coal mining families and coal mining communities. That's the message.
Pat, do you want to bring it to the big screen?
Yeah. All right. Thank you. So, dirty words. Think coal mining is dirty, coal combustion is dirty, renewable energy, sustainability, dirty words in the coal fields. Whoops, I went wrong. Sorry.
Big bucket.
Oh, we got that. Sorry. Okay, Rich Trump, FLCIO president, former president of United Mine Workers of America, former coal miner in Nemacolin, Pennsylvania. Actually, I had a case when I was a young lawyer where he was a witness for me in a mine safety matter in Pennsylvania. Look what he says. Nemacolin lives on coal. The coal mine my father went down to every day of their working lives, the power plant the mine feeds, the rail lines that carry coal to other plants. When these folks hear end coal, it sounds like a threat to destroy the value of our homes, to shut our schools and churches, to drive us away from the place our parents and grandparents are buried, to take away the work for that work that for more than 100 years has made us who we are. There's Nemacolin from the air. There's the coal barges over going along the Monongahela River. This is a former what we call coal camp, company town. That's what Nemacolin is. There's Nemacolin, 4th of July. There's Whitesville, West Virginia, in the heart of the West Virginia coal fields. Really prosperous, right? That's what coal has brought to coal field families and communities. But it's the only game in town in terms of jobs. You end coal, end jobs, literally end the way of life. Coal Strip, Montana. Unemployment, highest where the most coal is produced. Worst education opportunities, worst public services. This is what people feel. These are the people. This is the collateral damage of end coal. That doesn't mean that coal shouldn't be ended. It means you can't forget about these people. They vote. If you more voted for Al Gore, the world would be a different place if West Virginia had gone for Al Gore. He said the same thing about Tennessee, but especially in West Virginia. And that's Al Rogers. And this is just a little bit of national mining. This is what the other side says. Whoops. A little facts. Take away, kill those jobs, thousands and thousands of jobs. Not just in Appalachia, but around the country. Unable to push cap and trade, Obama and Chu, working to destroy America's natural resources, throwing hundreds of billions of dollars at solar, wind, etc. And here's their graph. Solar, can't afford it. Coal, affordable. If you don't include all those externalities. Now, what's the goal? I think it was in one of John's slides. The goal, internalize, externalize harm, environmental harm. That's what the law is about. That would help us along the road to a sustainable future if the law was enforced. You think there's not a law against exposing miners to black lung? Is there a law against dumping pollutants into streams? Is there a law that there was a law that prevented blowing off the tops of mountaintops and said no coal mine within 100 feet of an intermittent or perennial stream? And yet, regulatory agencies allowed it for 2 decades. And the rule wasn't changed until the last days of the George W. Bush administration. It was all done illegally. And enforce the law, that's a help to take us to a sustainable future. Now, I was going to read some of this. How are we doing with time? Okay. Well, the thoughtful miner below. This is a coal miner, former coal miner talking. I commend this blog to you to get a little of a sense of what people in the coal fields who understand what the real story is, who are able to take a step back and realize that they're being played by the industry and by politicians. The enormous amount of money, the huge advertising campaigns, clean coal. There's a big billboard in Charleston, West Virginia, that says clean, green, carbon-free coal. Energy's future. Honestly, how do they do that at carbon-free coal? The West Virginia coal system. Professor Alpert drove through West Virginia recently and saw the billboard. Well, I'm talking millions and millions of dollars to persuade the people that are exposed to all of these externalities that somebody's out to destroy their lives and destroy their communities. It's those enviros, it's those advocates of sustainability and renewable resources. That's the reality. And I don't have time to do this. I wanted to do it. Rich Trumka gave a talk recently. The quote I gave, I had on the screen there, from Trumka, wasn't the whole story. Let me just read a couple of things in closing. Surely common ground can be found between workers who want the retrofit jobs in clean air and public health. But we need to be honest that mass unemployment makes everything harder and feeds fear. Honest, constructive dialogue, this is Trump speaking, between workers and their communities and environmental advocates, between investors and companies, can forge pathways to fair and politically sustainable change, and without it, we'll not move forward. We have to work together to shape a process for how we're going to address climate risk by putting America back to work. And he has examples. How we're going to build a smart grid, retool our vehicle fleet, catch up with foreign competitors on high-speed rail, wind and solar, and so forth. And he ends with, we live on one planet that we share a common humanity that requires respect for each other's families and communities. We need dialogue, Trump has said, between environmentalists and workers and communities about the future of coal, a just transition to a low-carbon emissions economy. And he concluded, addressing climate risk is the path to a competitive, profitable future for investors, but the path is only open if it is a path to the economy that works for the 99% who seek good jobs, economic security, and healthy communities, not just in New York, but in Nemacolin, in Whitesville, West Virginia, and in countries around the world, from Australia to Poland to South Africa, countries that face the same issues and share the same climate with you and me. I can sum all this up again. I said it before. Beyond coal is a rational goal over the long run. But please leave no coal miner, no coal mining family, or coal field community behind. Paraphrasing Reverend King's letter from Birmingham jail, and this is a poor paraphrase, injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere. Thank you.
Why I'm very honored to be on a panel with these two scholars who I've followed for a long time and have so much respect for. Thank you for having me and giving me the chance to be part of this important event and exciting event for your journal. 3 years ago, as Professor Bull mentioned, I took a position at Florida State as a visiting scholar on energy and land use law. And my focus in that position was on the land use challenges to scaling up renewable energy. There are a number of angles on these challenges, from disadvantages to renewable projects in state siting statutes to our regulatory framework's inadequacy for addressing cumulative land impacts. But another angle, and one that may be easy to overlook in the renewable energy context as we're moving to a cleaner source of energy, is the continuing relevance of environmental justice in this transition towards greater reliance on renewable alternatives. So this is the focus of my presentation today. In the time I have with you, I'll first discuss the role of renewable energy in sustainable development and its potential for advancing environmental justice objectives. Second, I want to address conflicts that can arise between broad-based renewable energy goals and environmental justice at the local level. And this discussion will turn our attention to both how energy projects are cited, but also how renewable energy is defined. Third, I will discuss possibilities for avoiding conflicts between what are at their most basic compatible goals: renewable energy expansion for sustainable development and environmental justice. So, as Professor McKinley just made so clear, the energy sector in its current form is perhaps the most unsustainable, the most glaringly contrary to sustainable development goals. And in the U.S. and around the world, fossil energy is the single greatest contributor of greenhouse gas emissions that are responsible for climate change. And the threat of climate change, as Professor Durbach has noted today in his work, is come to signify at least the environmental problems that sustainable development responds to. So at the same time, climate change is expected to exacerbate global inequality. So, we get these graphs that show us how we use energy and what it goes for. It doesn't compare to the pictures you see of the damage that it causes, but these give you a sense of how reliant we are as a society on fossil energy within the U.S. and the carbon dioxide emissions that result for electricity. So even as leaving aside climate impacts of fossil energy, there are this wide range of more localized environmental effects of fossil energy production, from the devastating land impacts that we saw in those images to waste and water pollution from coal and oil and gas. Renewable resources largely avoid those effects, and although it's important to recognize that no energy source is entirely environmentally benign, cleaner sources of energy subject local communities to less environmental harm than our production and consumption of fossil fuels. So in these ways, renewable energy is a key component to sustainability, and because it contributes both to our environmental goals globally and locally, and also to the economic and social aspects of sustainable development. So following the history that we got from John Durbach of how the concept of sustainable development has emerged over the decades, this year is declared the United Nations International Year of Sustainable Energy for All. And you can see that the types of benefits that are identified for that might come from sustainable energy are not just connected to electricity, but to all of the range of benefits, economic and social, that can provide. As they discussed, energy poverty affects billions of people around the world. You see different figures, but nearly 20% of us live without access to basic energy services. And renewable energy is seen as holding promise for addressing some of those issues. And also there's hope at least that for some developing countries, renewable energy might provide the benefit of technological leapfrogging, or what's known as the term used to talk about the opportunity to bypass some of the pollution-intensive stages of development that industrialized countries have already gone through. So the debate continues over to what extent developing countries should be able to rely on fossil energy for their economic growth, but we don't have to really resolve that debate to recognize that the core environmental justice goal of reducing the total and uneven exposure to toxics and other environmental harms is served whenever renewable energy can be used. So in the U.S., so said, in the broadest sense, a transition toward greater reliance on renewable energy serves environmental justice and sustainable development goals. We see how that goal has emerged in the U.S., and the majority of states now have enacted renewable portfolio standards to promote renewable development. These standards mandate, or in some cases encourage, utilities to supply a certain percentage of electricity from renewable sources by a set date. And although about, I think, over 25 proposals for a similar policy at the federal level have been unsuccessful to date, the proposals keep coming. The latest from Rep. Bingaman proposing basically a standard that would support President Obama's goal of 80% clean energy by 2035. So to achieve such a transition, to scale up renewable energy involves inevitable siting decisions, where to put renewable generation. And siting for renewable energy has some constraints that apply to other resources and some that are unique to renewables. The most significant siting constraints are often access to the resource and resource intensity. So these maps just show you that you can't do utility scale facilities of every sort of resource in every part of the country, at least as readily. So this shows where the strongest winds are. Bobby Kennedy made the remark about Saudi Arabia wind. This shows what the resources are for PV solar, which can be successful in many places, but as you can see, a lot more intensity in the Southwest. A little bit different when you're thinking about concentrating solar resource, different ways to produce power from solar energy, and biomass, which I'll talk a little bit more about later, across the country, different degrees of resources. Another significant siting constraint is often transmission. There's often just simply not the infrastructure in place to reach the areas that we saw, especially looking back at the wind image in the center of the country, connecting that resource to the coast. And you can get a sort of chicken and egg problem with if you don't get one, you don't get one without the other, so you end up with neither. And then with those constraints, there's also the issue of local impacts and, in some cases, environmental justice. So over a decade ago, Professor J.B. Rule, not our Troy Rule, but J.B. Rule anticipated that sustainable development's multifaceted goals, which he called environment, economy, equity, policy triad, there would be a competition between sustainable development, or could be, between sustainable development and environmental justice. And he argued this would come because sustainable development is trying to serve all three of those goals, whereas in his view, environmental justice was putting equity above all else. So let's consider the potential for competition, looking at how renewable energy projects can affect host communities. And this really depends on the resource. So you saw on the RPS map how many states are promoting renewable energy. Well, what counts as renewable energy? What are the types of projects that are being promoted with those and other instruments? So typically it would include solar, it would include wind, it would include biomass, hydroelectric power, tidal energy. Some of these in their very early stages of development, some not having a lot of potential for expansion, such as hydroelectric, geothermal, and not, so quick note that there are many renewable energy projects being built in states that do not have RPS mandates, but these are the kinds of resources that would be included. So in the interest of time, I will focus on the three resources that have the most ubiquitous potential: wind, solar, and biomass. Here projects the increase in these non-hydropower resources. They have geothermal listed above solar. You see some different things with geothermal, which I didn't have a map for. It's much more concentrated in certain parts of the country than it's not accessible in the same way as solar as broadly. So considering wind first. Wind power, more than most other renewable resources, evokes radically different aesthetic perceptions. So, for example, in Kansas, the Flint Hills policy instruments around Flint Hills prairie areas building a large golf course on the coast of Scotland and was incensed to learn that on the coast there were now proposed to be turbines offshore that would ruin the landscape. So it's useful, I think, to pause and think about the distinctions that should be drawn between what is often characterized as NIMBY, not in my backyard, and environmental justice issues. And certainly there is some room for overlap, but they are not identical. And I'm actually one that dislikes the term NIMBY. I think it's used in a way that's overly dismissive of what can be legitimate objections in the public interest that often are deserving of respectful engagement. So I think it can be used in a reductive way, in an overbroad way. Environmental justice, of course, is raising distributive concerns, racial and socioeconomic concerns that in many NIMBY situations, Donald Trump, prime example, not raised. So there's been significant controversy around wind siting, but most often it involves opposition that is not rooted in an environmental justice concern. In fact, a lot of, in the tribal context, tribal advocates and tribal law scholars are more often concerned about environmental justice in the way that they've talked about earlier this morning, the economic development and barriers to access to bringing renewable energy projects to tribal land. So the wind and solar have been called the technologies of existence. They're considered to be consistent by many tribes with values that are important to intergenerational equity, environmental stewardship, and the Intertribal Council on Utility Policy has highlighted that there are over 4,000 megawatts of renewable energy potential on tribal land that could bring desperately needed economic development to impoverished tribal communities. So there are barriers that are associated with environmental justice, not that policy barriers, investment, and other barriers preventing those kinds of projects from thriving on tribal land. So the most significant environmental justice concerns in the wind context have been access. Nonetheless, there are some examples where utility-scale wind projects have been seen as affecting culturally significant land, or where there have been concerns about fair dealings with local communities. So similar issues have recently been addressed in the solar energy context by the Department of Energy and the Bureau of Land Management in developing an environmental impact statement under NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, for their multi-state solar energy development plans for tribal land. And as part of this effort, they have recognized the potential for environmental justice issues to arise when large-scale solar facilities are located on or near sites that have cultural artifacts or landscapes. But they also note that there are hazardous materials used in PV panels, for example. So even though under normal operating conditions those are contained in decommissioning, basically they just have to be well planned for because there are hazardous materials. So if they were properly disposed of or damaged in decommissioning, that could be a danger locally. Likewise, concentrated solar power uses coolants, lubricants, oils, molten salts, etc., that do pose a chance of spill. Again, these acknowledgments are not in any way to equate a large-scale solar power plant's environmental impact with a coal plant, for example, which will get, under the Clean Air Act, a permit to legally emit sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, mercury, CO2, the list goes on year after year by the ton. But they do point to the need for planning and maintenance to minimize potential impacts globally of spills or decommissioning. But so like wind, most solar projects are seen as offering significant environmental justice benefits, even at the local level. And it's not only where you would think when I showed you the map and you saw the intensity of the solar resource in the Southwest. Solar generation is seen as desirable ways to redevelop contaminated property, former landfills in some cases. So I'll return to that in a moment. Now let's talk about biomass. So this is a renewable resource of a completely different kind. And biomass refers in most contexts to crop or timber harvest wastes that can be burned to produce electricity. But depending on state definitions, biomass can include a wide range of other inputs. So for one of these are just two images of power plants that use biomass. Let's look at one particularly broad definition from the Florida statutes, a state without an RPS, but which does have, the southeast is the area that is expected to see the most growth in biomass production. Biomass means a power source comprised of but not limited to combustible residues or gases from forest products, manufacturing waste, byproducts or products from agricultural and orchard crops, waste and co-products from livestock and poultry operations, waste or byproducts from food processing, urban wood waste, municipal solid waste, municipal liquid waste treatment operations, landfill gas. So a very broad definition in some places. You could have a waste to energy facility term for trash incinerator that makes electricity could qualify as a biomass plant. So you think about the local impacts can be very different from one renewable resource to another. So the argument for, and biomass plants traditionally mostly rely on combustion, like fossil energy. So you have air emissions and you have ash waste. The argument, at least for traditional biomass as a valuable renewable resource, is that it's carbon neutral, which is essentially the argument that if the agricultural waste were allowed to decay in the field or were disposed of through open field burning, that there would be the same carbon would emit into the atmosphere, but without producing electricity. This is a controversial proposition. We don't have time to go into that tangent today, but whether or not one accepts the carbon neutrality justification for shifting towards biomass, it is clear that unlike wind and solar, there are indisputable health risks associated with burning biomass, and even if we assume carbon neutrality, the local air impacts will be affected because you're taking what would have been emitted over a wide area over a long period of time from one source, right? So community impact has to be a critical siting consideration. And these, when I lived in Tallahassee, these issues collided with environmental justice right in FSU's backyard, where a site was proposed for a biomass plant on Florida State property that was in close proximity to a number of schools and residences in a predominantly minority, lower-income neighborhood. It became quickly controversial. There were questions about the propriety of the involvement of university officials, whether they had financial ties. Those were resolved in court. There was a lot of anger among people in the proposed host neighborhood who felt excluded from communications between the city and the university, and the residents, as well as the commissioner from that area filed a notice of intent to sue the Florida Department of Environmental Protection for issuing an air permit. All the documents are still on the DEP's website, and based their claims on a range of things, but including explicitly environmental racism. So at the time, there was also support from other neighborhoods, as well as from some environmental groups, not all, but some who had been in favor of renewable energy projects. And what struck me about the debate at the time was that there was it seemed to be so little consciousness about the environmental justice issues that this site raised. And so you would hear supporters who were disappointed about the project, which was eventually withdrawn by the developer because of the controversy. And it was typically cast as, well, this was a PR failure, right? We didn't explain this well enough. Or it was a failure of the opponents to recognize and understand the technology that actually was safe. And there didn't seem to be a consciousness that you can have the wrong site for even a project that might be legitimate. So they moved a couple of counties over, encountered some similar opposition, and then even north of Tallahassee in Valdosta, Georgia, a very similar set of environmental justice concerns raised around a biomass plant. And the state and local chapters of the NAACP wrote a letter to President Obama saying this is a classic case of environmental racism. So you see this clash between what was coming to the community, these renewable energy developers coming to the community with what they thought was a renewable beneficial project and citing it in such a way that it was very, very upsetting for a lot of people. So this discussion, I think, underscores two things. One, the categorical promotion of renewable energy misses important differences resource by resource in terms of local impact, and failing to do that differentiation is only going to complicate efforts to scale up and site, because we don't usually see differentiation reflected in the regulatory instruments that promote renewable energy as a category. And second, renewable energy projects can't proceed as if their sustainability profile trumps or otherwise cancels out environmental justice concerns at the local level. There may be broad consistency between the shift to renewable energy, but that doesn't, and environmental justice, as we've discussed this morning, but that doesn't mean that in each individual site those issues are not going to come up. And they certainly are relevant in the context of biomass facility siting, which, as I said, can in some states even be a waste energy facility. So I want to turn to how we might avoid these conflicts before turning to the specific siting projects. First, I always emphasize efficiency, conservation, distributed generation. Okay, so before we talk about how we can avoid those conflicts in the siting context, remember that efficiency and conservation are non-polluting ways to reduce the need for new energy facilities in the first place. So they break the mold of ever-increasing demand met by ever-increasing new capacity. And John Dernbach has been doing very important work on clarifying for us what is the state of energy efficiency law today, and the importance of those means of providing energy, basically using energy that isn't being used now. It cannot be overemphasized. Distributed generation, likewise, where we're integrating energy with existing land use. Tor Rule, in his article on renewable energy in the neighbors, has shown that it's discussed how the implications for environmental justice are much less when you're using these non-polluting forms of energy on site. So these approaches to energy are probably the most important and unequivocally consistent with environmental justice and sustainability objectives. In the siting context, however, I think that getting this right matters, and I think that it can be done because most of the infrastructure is not built yet. So between 2008 and 2035, the U.S. Energy Information Administration was projecting between 45 and 65% of new generation would come from renewables. And the graph I showed you before showed that biomass will be one of the large segments of that, along with wind. So with most of the infrastructure not built yet, we are in a position to approach this a little bit differently than we have in the past, avoid some of the siting mistakes that gave rise to the environmental justice movement in other contexts, landfills, hazardous waste facilities, etc. So, and it seems to me that as a component of sustainable development, renewable energy can and should, as much as possible, model the sustainable development principles that it is a part of helping us to reach. So where and how can these issues be addressed? If we start with the siting frameworks, before the 70s, most power plant siting of any kind, of course it wasn't renewable at that time, was primarily decided through a local process. Then there was a shift towards state siting. Many of the same complaints that we hear today about local and environmental opposition to facilities led to this impetus towards a shift to centralized state siting approval, basically taking ultimate siting decisions away from local governments and coordinating and expediting permitting and streamlining, controlling the pace and length of challenges to site decisions. So we had legislation emerge across a range of states, but about half the states did not alter local land use authority for energy siting. So in many states, Kansas being one, Missouri being another, there's not a centralized state agency that approves power plants. So In the last few years, we've also seen specific to renewables, because those apply to power plants of less, usually above a particular megawatt size. We've seen expedited regulations targeting renewables, trying to assist renewables to be sited faster. But we don't typically see in those instruments similar efforts to site the well. And that seems like a flaw in these, especially when we're promoting in a categorical way renewable resources with different environmental profiles. So it seems to me we might be able to avoid some of the mistakes of siting if we can incorporate environmental justice into those siting statutes. Most of them do not do so explicitly. New York is an exception. New York had a siting statute. It expired. It's been adopted or enacted and has an explicit requirement of environmental justice being considered. Connecticut has enacted an environmental justice law that applies in the energy context, not only to renewables. And there are other states that have some kind of framework for considering these issues. But in most of the siting statutes, it's not an explicit consideration. And there's also real potential for local land use and energy planning. And that's relevant in states that have centralized siting as well as states that don't, because even where the state may have the ultimate say, localities have a significant influence on the process. So the EPA and the National Renewable Energy Lab have done a lot of work on identifying, well, where might we use already contaminated land and use it for renewable energy. This is one of the maps. I've created many, many maps that show where contaminated properties are that could be reused for wind or solar or biomass. And so I'm just showing you the biopower map that they have. And they have some of them state by state. So these demonstrate how we could basically use land efficiency, make use of these areas, redevelop. But Joel Eisen and others who've written about redevelopment brownfields have shown that sometimes that will be an asset to the environmental justice context that may exist around a contaminated site. And sometimes it won't. It depends on the use. It depends on what the needs are of that area. So a map like this might be a good starting point. So it's good for EPA and NRAL to be identifying these properties, but it's a starting point for reuse that can then be picked up by state and local governments to say, go in and look with the community specific information that they have to say, well, would redevelopment of this site be an asset from an environmental justice standpoint as well? With the biomass map, one might have some questions. You see how many dots there are, and you see what happened in Tallahassee, you see what happened in Valdosta and other places. Not all of these may actually work from an environmental justice standpoint, but that's something that states and local governments can do in a proactive way, in cooperation using this data and the rapid response team that EPA has set up for helping states and local governments try to redevelop contaminated properties. So I think that there's room for local governments to do proactive planning in using these kinds of maps or for other properties where they break out of just the reactive mode of waiting for a property to come in, a proposal to come in that becomes controversial. They can do some of that work for us. We know that projects need to be built. We're talking 45 to 65% of new generation. And it's not necessary to just sit back and wait for developers to do a guessing game about what area might be acceptable for the community. So in the end, I'm running out of time, so I want to say basically, it seems to me that sustainable energy policies can and should mirror and model sustainable development principles as much as possible. And that means charting a careful course between both being critical of what we see and being solution-oriented. We can't just say no to things. We have to say, if not this, what? And if not, and if this, how? And trying to assist in helping to scale up, not just standing in the way. So that's part of the reason that the conversations and the dialogue and the public participation that are so important in the siting context need to be done in advance, knowing if we know we want to go that way, start having those conversations. Thank you very much.
Okay, I want to thank Professor Outcoat, Professor Durbin-Bach, and Professor we have about 10 minutes for questions. So I want to open up the floor. Speak really loudly. I won't make you use one of these microphones, but if you'd like to use the microphone, you can grab it. We'll give about 10 minutes. We'll open it up for questions. Please go ahead.
I have a question for Professor Dernbach. One of the things that you mentioned is that, in general, as a principle of sustainable development, the polluters should bear the cost of pollution. And I'm just curious, it seems to me that right now the national public might not be so receptive to that idea, because if that type of idea gets introduced in the national dialogue, they're going to call the person who said it a wealth redistributor, and there's just going to be a lot of charged political rhetoric behind it. So I guess what I'm asking is, how do we rise above the rhetoric and have a serious national conversation about sustainable development?
Well, that's the example that you provide goes right to the core of how hard some of these issues are getting to be. When I worked for the government in the state of Pennsylvania, the work that I tried to do, I worked really hard on getting to the middle 60 or 80%, all right, of the American public, because I think the middle 60 to 80% of the American public gets this. And I think that you get past the people on the extremes on both ends to some degree by crafting something that listens to what other people are saying, is responsive to what other people are saying, but that is factually grounded. And I mean, the argument that I would make on the wealth redistribution is that's already going on. Okay, you can, if you want to be passionate about this, you can say there's not so much a war on coal. Okay, because coal to some degree is our best friend and our worst enemy. And if we don't come to grips with the fact that both of those things are true, okay, then we can't have an honest dialogue. I mean, there's a longer conversation you can have, but a lot of this, I think, is about persistence and explanation.
Can I respond to that too? I think it's very simple. The law for centuries in Anglo-American jurisprudence, the law of public and private nuisance is that you can't use your property so as to injure that of another. And so when you have laws that say you can't externalize cost, you pay for your pollution, that's nothing new. What you're really talking about here is protecting private property rights and the rights of families and communities against those who externalize. I'm happy to have that argument anytime.
Good.
It seems that one of the problems that was discussed, especially in the presentation on coal, is that there's a lack of enforcement. That there are laws that are designed to address some of these issues, and they're either not being enforced or they're being enforced ineffectively or inconsistently. And I guess as law students, or I'm a law student, and a lot of us here are law students, what are we doing in the educational system to improve on enforcement and just in general on enforcement and ensuring that the laws we do have are being effective and achieving their ends?
Probably we could all answer that question at different degrees. I mean, the big thing I would say is it's if you look across the United States and you look at the environmental law programs that are offered in American law schools, and you compare those to the programs that existed 20 or 30 years ago, I'd have to say that pretty much every school in the country that is doing environmental law now to any degree is doing it better than it was 20 to 30 years ago. That empowers people who are about to become lawyers, because you learn things that can be useful to your clients down the road. The other big thing is that there are more opportunities for folks outside of government to have impacts on government enforcement decisions now, because there are more sophisticated non-governmental organizations, because the internet and other electronic resources empower lots of people outside the government in ways that they were
If I just follow up, I'd also say that when you're in a law school classroom, whether you're the teacher or the student, the search for black letter law is not efficient because that's not the real world. So both law teachers and law students should be talking about not only the black letter law, but the reality of is it enforced and how is it enforced and how can we do better. And these are core issues that should be discussed before you ever get out there in the real world. It's hard, though, to describe. When I was showing them these slideshows, these are real people in real places. And, I show pictures because that helps you understand a little bit about the lack of enforcement. I guess that gave rise to your question. But the real world is far beyond black letter law.
A follow-up on that as well is, it's just a reality that the amount of resources dedicated to enforcement are a very small piece of the enforcement pie. So that has implications for the design of regulatory enforcement mechanisms, right? Because if you can't enforce if you can't monitor and enforce for an entire regulated community, what is the structure and design of the legal mechanism for enforcement that will have the deterrent effect on pollution that will be effective even if you don't have EPA's truck driving up to your CAFO or whatever it might be. So in that sense, from a cost and design standpoint, it's an interesting thing to consider when you're in a resource-constrained environment.
And I think there's another point that's important too, and that is instead of viewing EPA, for example, as being engaged in war on coal, how about there's an effort to enforce the law? On the one side they say, well, they're extreme. Well, if you don't like the law, like the buffer zone rule with mountaintop removal, change it. Don't break it.
This question is primarily for Professor Amka. You spoke on the three principles of efficiency, conservation, and the distribution of generation. But the distribution of generation is so fundamentally against what we've been about in terms of energy policy for the last 200 years, where we have very centralized power plants that then send the power elsewhere. Professor McGinley spoke kind of on trying to build a 21st century economy on 19th century fuel. So what, in your opinion, what needs to come first? Is it we need to prove the viability of this economically before we can put it into law, or does the law need to kind of facilitate the economic side of it?
Of distributed generation?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, distributed generation, with most of what you'll read will say that unless we modernize the grid, there's a limit on how much can be absorbed. We're nowhere close to that maximum. So if that comes in between, some will say 15, some will say 20%, and that's going to vary depending on where in the grid. There's a lot of room for growth. And there's obvious land use benefits, right, because you're reusing property. The bigger barrier is, probably, like you say, the dominant structure and a whole set of legal frameworks built up around supporting that, facilitating a centralized, large power plant model. And so the regulatory adapting that we have to do to both make that work with when you have a monopoly utility in place, or when to deal with financing issues, right? So you can't, how to make it easier to put a rooftop solar system onto a rooftop without having to have the owner of that property come up with, it's thousands of dollars. But there are a range of interesting prospects and new models that are being proposed and thought through that, could help to move more distributed generation. And it doesn't have to only be rooftop. We were talking last night about smaller scale, community scale distributed generation. So it doesn't have to only be on site.
Do you have some examples of some states where the legislature or the regulatory commission is doing good things in that direction for efficiency and distributed generation? Like, what states are the best states for that right now?
Well, efficiency and distributed generation might be different in that respect. You can speak to efficiency. Distributed generation, you have there. A lot of the states have done have adjusted the rules for interconnection, have adopted net metering. I think most states have net metering now. So there's been a fairly rapid change over the last few years in that respect. Financing is still a big issue. California's done a lot with rooftop. North Carolina's had some progress with trying to integrate distributed generation with utilities. It's kind of stop and go, but it's made some efforts on that. And there's independent non-state entities that are working on this. So, for example, I was just reading about a project recently called Solar Mosaic, where they're using crowdfunding to put solar installations on social justice organizations and reducing their energy costs by having, like all of us in this room, contributing some part of the installation of that project and then being paid back slowly over time while the social justice organization is reaping benefits in their energy costs. So it's not only governmental where we can make some progress on that, but we definitely have to do more on that.
On energy efficiency, probably the most powerful thing I've seen is there's a graph in the recent National Research Council report on energy efficiency in the United States. And the graph shows a line that sort of trends up and like this for U.S. per capita electricity consumption. And then it shows two sort of more or less flattish lines, a little squigglish because things change from year to year, from 1970 on, showing per capita energy consumption in New York and California. And the point being is those states have managed since about 1970 or so to stabilize their per capita electricity consumption. And they've done that actually with a range of policies and tools. You decouple electric utility profits from the generation of electricity. You have a little bit of a charge on your electric bill that goes back to paying for, that goes into a fund that pays for renewable energy and energy efficiency. You set energy efficiency goals, and you provide incentives for the folks that generate electricity to meet those goals. And there are other tools as well. And so the evidence seems to indicate, and this is really important from a sustainability point of view, is you don't need to have increasing energy consumption to have increasing prosperity and an increasing standard of living. And in fact, you probably at this point need to be thinking about just exactly the opposite, and that is how to decouple, quality of life from rising energy consumption. And New York and California provide examples of how to move in that direction.
We're out of time, so we'll have more opportunities for questions if you come to the reception at the end of the symposium this afternoon. We will reconvene at 1 o'clock here. Actually, come up, if you want pizza, come at about 12:45 for the Shakespeare's Pizza here. And then we'll have our distinguished lecturer, Eileen Galna, and we'll have our keynote speaker, Michael Gerard, here this afternoon at 1 o'clock. So thank you very much for your questions. Let's give a round.